The cold metal cage shook with every step the humans took, and the tiny alien girl inside pressed herself into the corner. Her small hands gripping the bars as fear ran through her thin body, her glowing eyes wide and full of terror. She was the last of her kind, and now she was trapped in a place she could not understand. Larry was her name. Though no one here knew it, and maybe no one cared, she had been hiding on a broken ship in deep space for days, maybe weeks, her body weak, her voice silent, and her heart beating slow and scared. When the big creatures found her, they shouted and laughed and pointed their strange weapons at her. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the floor too tired to run, too small to fight. They picked her up like a toy and locked her inside a silver cage just big enough to sit in. The lights above her blinked and buzzed like angry stars, and the air smelled of oil, metal, and something sharp. Something dead. She tried not to breathe too deeply, but there was no clean air, no place to hide, no way out. The humans spoke a language she did not know, but she could feel their moods. She could hear their cruel jokes, even without knowing their words. Their voices were loud and rough and full of power, the kind that breaks things, the kind that eats the weak. One man in a dark coat stared at her longer than the others. His face had lines and scars, and his eyes looked like cold glass. He came closer while the others walked away. He crouched in front of the cage and looked at her with strange silence. Not anger, not pity, just quiet. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. He reached a hand inside, and she flinched, her breath stuck in her throat. His fingers stopped inches away, and slowly placed a small, round thing on the floor of her cage. It looked like food. She did not move. He said something slow and soft, but she could not tell what it meant. His voice did not sound like the others. She looked at the food, then at his face, then back at the food. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but her fear was louder. She slapped the food away and crawled to the far corner, her body shaking like a leaf in the wind. The others laughed from far away and called out to him again, more words she could not understand. But the sound was mocking. The sound made her feel small. The man did not laugh. He only looked at the smashed food, then at her, then he stood up and walked away, his boots heavy against the floor. Time passed. She did not know how much. The lights never changed. The cold never left her bones. Sometimes she slept, sometimes she cried, but always she waited for the humans to come back and do what monsters do. Maybe they would eat her, maybe they would sell her, maybe they would throw her into space. She did not know. One day, the voices grew louder, many humans talking at once, angry words fast and hot. She looked through the bars and saw them pointing at her and arguing. Some held strange devices, others waved their arms. She saw one man make a slicing motion across his neck, and her heart froze in her chest. She knew that sign had meant death on many worlds then. The man with the cold eyes stepped in again. He said one word, not loud, but strong enough to make everyone stop. They looked at him confused, then angry, but they did not fight him. He walked to the cage, unlocked it, and picked it up with both hands, carrying her like she was not a prisoner, but a thing that mattered. She did not understand what was happening. She kept her eyes on him, waiting for the moment he would drop the cage into fire or water or worse. But he carried it alone, through quiet halls and metal doors, and long tunnels of steel. The sounds of the others faded until there was only the hum of a ship engine and the steady beat of his boots. At last, he placed the cage down in a small room with a soft bed, a table, and a light that did not hurt her eyes. He opened the cage door, but did not force her out. He placed food on the table and water in a clear cup, then sat in a chair with his back to her and said nothing. Larry stayed inside the cage for hours, her small hands clutching the bars, her eyes watching his every move. But he did not move much. He just sat there looking at a small screen in his hand, not looking at her, not speaking, not threatening her. And slowly her fear began to change. It did not go away, but it shifted into something strange, something she had not felt since before the war. The metal door hissed open, and Lyri's body froze. Her fingers tightened around the cage bars, and her heart pounded louder than the engine hum. The man was back again, the one with the quiet eyes and heavy steps, and something in his hands. A folded cloth and a small plate of food. The smell was warm and strange, and it made her stomach twist and growl against her ribs. She pressed herself to the corner of the cage, her glowing eyes narrow and scared. The man said nothing as he knelt in front of the open cage door, his face calm like a silent mountain. His hand moved forward, and she flinched hard, ready for pain, ready for grabbing or cutting or worse, but the hand stopped right outside. The bars opened, palms steady, fingers wide and still and gentle. For a long time he waited there, and she did not move. The room was quiet, no angry voices, no loud laughter, just the soft buzz of machines and the sound of breathing, hers fast and shallow, his slow and even. And then he said something, one single word, low and calm. She did not understand it, but the way he said it made her heart slow just a little. He placed the plate on the floor near the cage and pushed it forward with one finger, just close enough for her to reach but not so close it touched the bars, and then he pulled his hand back and stayed kneeling, eyes watching her without fear or hunger or anger, and something about that made her feel even more confused. She looked at the food. It was warm and round and soft and smelled nothing like her home, but it did not smell bad. She looked at him again, still, and then she reached forward, one shaking hand slowly moving through the bars, and picked it up. Her fingers trembled as she brought it to her lips and took a bite, tiny and it melted in her mouth, and for a moment her eyes filled with tears, not because it hurt, but because it didn't, and she did not know what to do with something that didn't hurt. The man stayed where he was, and she ate slowly, bite by bite, never taking her eyes off him. When she finished, he stood up slowly and backed away, giving her space, giving her silence, and she watched as he sat down in the corner of the room on a soft bench and began to work with his hands. Small tools, wires, a round device. He never spoke again, just worked quietly and let her be. She stayed inside the cage, even though the door was open. Fear still sat heavy in her bones, and trust was something she no longer remembered how to feel. But that night when she slept, she dreamed of light and warmth, and soft voices instead of screaming, and fire, and she woke with tears on her cheeks, and the blanket he had left now covering her shoulders. The next day he returned again, this time with something different, a small ball that lit up when touched. He rolled it gently toward her, and she watched it spin across the floor, glowing like the moons of her home. She did not touch it, not at first, but when he left the room, she reached out and tapped it, and it lit up again, pulsing soft colors that made her chest ache with memory. Each day was the same, and each day was different. He brought food and soft cloth and strange tools. He never locked the cage again, and she never stepped out, not yet, but every day she came closer to the door, and every night he sat in the same spot, working with wires and lights, and never looking at her too much. One day he brought something strange, a screen that showed symbols and sounds. He touched it, and a picture of a tree appeared, and he said a word, then pointed to the screen and said it again. Then he looked at her and waited, and she knew he was teaching her. He wanted her to learn his words, to speak with him, to understand. She did not know why, but she wanted to understand. She wanted to know what he was thinking, what he was planning, what he was hoping. She sat near the edge of the cage and listened as he repeated the word again and again. And slowly she whispered it back, her voice dry and broken. But real tree, she said, and he smiled, and her heart skipped. Something strange, something soft, something she had not felt since before the war, since before everything was taken from her. The days turned into something like peace, and the fear in her bones began to melt, not all at once, not fast, but slow, like snow under morning light. She still watched him with caution, but not with terror, and when he left the room, she no longer shook, she only waited, and when he returned, her eyes would follow him, not with fear, but with something close to curiosity. Did not know his name, not yet, but she knew his voice, she knew his hands, and she knew he had not hurt her, and that alone made him more than anything she had met since the sky burned above her world and the ships came down and took everything. And so she waited and listened and learned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she began to wonder what might come next. Leary sat on the soft floor, her legs pulled tight against her chest, as the ship shook gently around her. Outside the small window, stars drifted by, like glowing dust, and the deep dark sky stretched forever in every direction, but she was not looking at the stars. Her eyes stayed on the door, her ears listened for footsteps, and her hands held the edge of the blanket the human had given her. The cage was gone now, left behind in the other room, and for the first time she had space to move, but freedom was not the same as safety, not for her, not here, not with a creature so large and strange and silent. The human had not spoken much since they left the station. He moved around the ship with slow steps, soft sounds, and calm hands. He had not touched her again, and yet she could feel him in every corner of the ship, as if the walls knew his name. She had tried to open the door once, a small panel near the wall blinking with lights. She touched it, and a sharp sound rang out. Then nothing. She tried to pull the handle, but it was sealed tight, locked like the sky had been locked above her world during the invasion. She knew then there was no way to leave, and her heart sank deep into her stomach. She wandered the small ship slowly, step by step, careful not to touch anything strange. Machines lined the walls, soft lights pulsed across wires and screens, and a warm humming filled the air. Like a voice too big to understand, she saw food neatly placed on a tray, clean water in a clear cup, and a folded cloth that smelled like sun and wind. Even though this place had neither, each day passed in quiet rhythms the human worked on broken metal pots, wires flashing between his fingers, while music played low from the walls, soft notes full of colors she had never heard before. Sometimes he would leave food for her and sit nearby, not close enough to scare her, but not far enough to forget she was there. And when he spoke, it was always one word at a time, slow and patient, as if trying to teach her again. She learned the names of simple things: cup, hand, sky, ship, star. He pointed and spoke and waited, and she repeated the sounds slowly, awkwardly, until they began to shape inside her mouth like pieces of a new world, one that might be safe if she could believe it. But trust came slowly, like cold fire. It burned without light, and left her restless at night. She would curl up in a corner near the engine, where the hum was soft and steady, like the heartbeat of a giant, and she would stare at the shadows on the ceiling, wondering if her people were still alive, wondering if the stars would ever lead her back to them. One night she woke with a sharp cry, the dream still heavy in her chest, smoke and fire, and screams, and the cold hands of soldiers dragging her from the ruins of her home. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up, shaking and breathing hard, and there he was, the human, standing in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just watching with eyes that held no threat, only something quiet and deep. He walked over, slowly knelt beside her, and held out a small glowing stone, its light warm and soft like morning sun. She reached out with trembling fingers, and took it, and he said one word again: safe. The next morning, she found the door open, not the one to space, but the inner door, the one that led to the pilot's seat. And the stars. She stepped through it slowly, her feet light against the floor, and saw him sitting there watching the stars, his hands on the controls, the blue light from the screens dancing across his skin. He turned and smiled, not big, not wide, just enough to say welcome, and she walked closer until she could see the stars, too endless and bright and full of secrets, and something inside her shifted, like a thread pulling loose from her fear. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just breathing and watching and sharing the silence, as if it was something alive and gentle and new. Later that day, he gave her a soft cloth bag with small tools inside, metal and wires and blinking lights, and he showed her how to hold them, how to twist them, how to fit them into broken parts and bring something back to life. Her hands were small but quick, and her mind followed his movements, carefully copying him piece by piece. They built something together, a small drone with wings like a beetle, and lights that blinked when touched, when it floated above their heads. She laughed, soft and broken, but real, and he smiled again, that same quiet smile that made the room feel less cold that night. When she curled up near the engine, she did not shake, and when he walked past her on his way to rest, she whispered one word, not in her language, but in his: thank you. And in the silence that followed, her voice echoed like light across the stars. The air was sharp, like broken glass, and the wind howled across the frozen land as Leary ran, her tiny feet slipping on the ice, her breath thick and fast as smoke, her eyes wide with fear, and her heart pounding louder than the storm behind her. The door had been left open just for a moment, just long enough for her to escape. She had waited for that chance. Every day, watched the human, every time he touched the controls, every time he left a panel open, every time he forgot to lock something. And now, finally, the way was clear, and she took it. Without thinking, without planning, only moving, only running, only trying to get away. The snow was deep and cruel, and the cold bit through the soft cloth she wore as if it were nothing. Her skin burned with every step, and the darkness around her pressed in like a closing hand. But she did not stop. She could not stop, not when she had come this far, not when freedom was so close. The stars above were hidden behind thick clouds, and the sky offered no light, no path, only shadows and silence, broken only by her small feet crunching the snow and her sharp breaths tearing from her throat. Her legs ached, her arms trembled, but still she ran. Still she pushed forward until her legs gave out and she collapsed behind a jagged rock, her hands gripping the cold stone, her body shaking. She looked back, expecting to see him chasing her, expecting his heavy steps to shake the ground, expecting the roar of his voice, but there was nothing. No one followed, only the wind, only the dark, and something about that made her even more afraid. She curled up against the rock, trying to stay warm, trying to stop her teeth from shaking, trying to breathe, but the cold was sinking into her bones like ice water, and her fingers were turning blue. She closed her eyes and wished for a cave, or a shelter, or even fire, something, anything to hide her from the cold. And from him then she heard it, not the wind, not the human, something else, something clicking, something heavy, something not natural. Her eyes snapped open, and she crawled forward, trying to see through the darkness, and then she saw them red lights moving low and fast, across the snow, metal legs stabbing the ground, long claws dragging behind, sharp and smooth like blades. It was a creature, but not alive, wires and armor instead of skin, and eyes that glowed like blood. It moved without sound, without breath, without mercy. Leary gasped and crawled backward, too scared to scream, too scared to run, and the creature turned toward her, its lights flashing and its body rising tall and cruel and wrong, and it charged, the snow flying behind it. As it leaped toward her, and she knew this was the end, she closed her eyes and braced for pain, but it never came. Instead, there was a loud crack like thunder and a flash of light, and then she opened her eyes and saw the creature lying still, its lights gone, its body broken, smoke rising from its chest, and behind it stood the human healed. Something long and dark in his hands, something that hummed with power, and his eyes were hard like stone, his face cold and unreadable, but he was breathing fast, his chest rising and falling, like waves crashing on rock, and his voice when he spoke was low and shaking. He walked to her, slowly knelt beside her, and reached out, not to grab, not to harm, but to lift her, and she did not fight, she did not pull away. Her body was too cold, too tired, too small to move, and he carried her back across the snow, through the wind, through the dark, and into the warmth of the ship heat. Placed her on the soft bed, wrapped her in thick blankets, and pressed a warm stone into her hands. Then he sat beside her, and watched her, like a guard, like a shield, like someone who had not slept in days. She looked at him, her teeth still shaking her lips, too cold to speak, and he spoke a word that she had learned, a word he had said before, a word that now sounded like lightsaber. Filled her eyes, not from pain, not from fear, but from something deeper, something like shame, something like confusion. Because she had run, and he had followed, she had fled, and he had saved her. And she did not understand why the heat from the blankets soaked into her skin, and her shaking slowed. Her breathing softened, and she felt sleep pulling her down like a soft wave, and before she closed her eyes, she whispered a single word, small and broken, and barely there. Sorry. The human looked at her, and said nothing, but his eyes were softer now, less like glass, more like sky, and when she woke again hours later, he was still there, still watching, still waiting, still protecting him. The door was still open. Leary sat near the warm wall, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes watching the human from across the room. He was working again, tools and wires in his hands, soft light glowing around him like a gentle fire. She did not speak, but he looked up, and nodded once, and she nodded back, her heart calm but full of questions she could not say out loud, not yet. She touched the back of her shoulders where her wings used to be. The skin was rough, and scarred, and cold, even when the rest of her was warm. Once long ago they had been bright and soft and full of light wings that let her fly above the silver trees of her home, wings that had moved like water through air, wings that had made her free, but the fire had taken them, the fire and the soldiers and the screams, and now there was only silence, where flight had once lived, only pain, where beauty had once grown, and she had never shown that part of her to anyone, not even him. That morning he had brought a new device, something small and strange with soft blue lights and a quiet pulse like a heartbeat. He had placed it on the table and said a word. She did not know, then pointed to her back, then to the device, then back again, and she understood what he was asking, and her body tensed. She wanted to run, to hide, to shake her head and crawl under the bed. But she did not move. She only sat and stared, and thought about what it meant to say yes to let him touch the scars, to let him see what was broken and lost and gone forever. Then, slowly, with hands that did not stop shaking, she stood and walked over to him. She turned her back and pulled aside the cloth and waited. Her breath stuck in her throat, her eyes shut tight, her whole body still as stone. His fingers were soft, not cold, not sharp, not cruel. They moved with care, and silenced his touch, so light it felt like a whisper. He pressed something cool against her skin, and it hummed gently, a sound like sleep and sky, and slowly her breath came back, and she opened her eyes, and felt something strange, something warm and real and deep. He did not try to heal the scars, not fully, but he cleaned them, and placed soft light over the worst places, and wrapped her in warmth and silence. And when he finished, he stepped back and said the word again, the one she did not know, and pointed to the device, then to her heart. She looked at the screen beside the device, and saw something she had not seen in a long time. Not since the war, not since her wings were lost. She saw a shape that looked like her, not broken, not perfect, but whole and new. And she reached out with one finger, and touched the screen and smiled. Without meaning to, that night, he brought her a small pad and a pen, and showed her how to draw. Her hand was clumsy, but her mind was clear, and she drew a tree like the ones from her home. And above the tree she drew a pair of wings, not as they were now, but as they had been once, shining wide, full of stars and song. She handed the pad to him, and he stared at the drawing for a long time, silent and still, and then he picked up the pen and drew something beside it, a figure small and human standing below the tree, reaching up with one hand toward the wings. And when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes, something like understanding, something like promise. The next morning she awoke to find the ship filled with soft music, not loud, not sharp, just a gentle sound, full of strings and wind, and in the middle of the room sat a gift, a tiny speaker, glowing with her color, and beside it, a new device made for her hands. Small and light and warm to the touch, When she pressed the button, it spoke not in his voice but hers. It played back the word she had said the day before, her first word in his language, the word that meant safety and hope and trust, and then it asked her to speak again. She looked at him, and he nodded, and she pressed the button and whispered another word. This one smaller, this one older, this one from her own language, and the device repeated it back, soft and perfect and whole, and her heart lifted like wings in wind. She spent hours that day recording words. One by one, new words, old words, words of fear, words she had forgotten, and the sound of her voice filled the ship like sunlight pouring through a crack in a wall that had been closed for too long. That night, as the stars blinked outside and the engines whispered low, she sat beside the human, not close but not far, and she said a word in his language, then a word in hers, then pointed to him, and then to her chest, and he looked at her and said the words back, and they sat like that, speaking without fear, sharing without shame, until sleep came and took them both gently into the dark asterisk. The ship moved through black space like a shadow in a sea of stars, and Leary stood near the window, her hands pressed to the glass, her eyes locked on the glowing path ahead, her breath steady but her heart heavy with memories. Behind her the human checked systems and watched the monitors, his face calm, but his movements fast and sharp, like he knew danger was close. They had left the quiet moon days ago. After she showed him the picture of her home, a place now buried in smoke and ash, but still calling to her from across the stars, he had looked at the drawing for a long time, and said nothing, then pointed at the sky, and said one word, home, and she nodded and whispered yes. Now they flew through deep space, crossing sectors full of silence and storms and ships with bad eyes and worse hearts. Leary spent hours learning to read the maps. He showed her blinking dots, lines and codes that glowed red, or green or blue, depending on how much trouble waited ahead. She did not like the red, and there was always redundant. The red turned into flashing lights and loud sounds. The ship shook hard, and the human yelled a word she did not know, but his voice was sharp and his hands moved fast. Then the ship twisted, and something outside exploded, and she fell to the floor, as the lights went dark for one breath, for two, then bright again, and he reached down to lift her back up, his arms strong and sure. Outside the window, she saw them, fast ships with broken wings and sharp teeth. They followed close and fired again, but the human did not run. He turned the ship and flew right at them, weaving through their fire like a bird through trees, and Leary held tight to the chair as sparks flew and alarms screamed, and still the human did not stop. He said her name once, just once, and it filled her chest with something hot and cold at the same time, because it was the first time he had spoken it, and it sounded right, even in his voice, even in the middle of fear. She stood and ran to the control panel, and he pointed to the side door, to the drone they had built together, the little thing with wings and lights. She grabbed it with shaking hands, and opened the bay, and sent it flying into the dark. It blinked 3 times, then dove toward the enemy ship, and just before they fired again, the drone burst with light, not fire but something brighter, something that blinded the attackers for a moment, just enough for the human to turn hard and shoot once, twice, 3 times, and then the danger was gone. The silence that followed was loud and strange and full of beating hearts and shallow breath. Leary sat on the floor, her hands over her chest, her eyes wide with wonder and fear and pride, and when the human came over and sat beside her, she leaned into his side and did not pull away. Later, when they fixed the ship and cleaned the burn marks from the walls, she found one piece of the drone melted but still glowing, and she kept it in her pocket as a memory, not of war but of choice. They reached her home system 3 days later, the space around it thick with dust and floating wrecks, old ships, broken buildings, spinning slow in the dark. The planet below was quiet, no lights, no signals, just a single weak beacon, blinking from the surface like a heartbeat refusing to die. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they both knew they were not done yet. He guided the ship through the dead air, carefully avoiding traps and floating mines that still drifted from the last attack, and when they landed, the ground shook slightly, as if the world remembered the pain and had not yet forgiven them. Air outside was dry and cold, the sky filled with gray clouds, and the buildings ahead looked like bones, tall and broken and empty. She stepped down the ramp slowly, her feet touching her world again after so long, and her knees nearly gave out as the memories rushed in. He stood beside her, his hand close but not touching, ready but waiting, and she took a breath deep and full of dust and light, and pointed toward the beacon, and they walked together through the ruins, through the ashes, through the silence of what once was. They found it under a hill, hidden by stone and shield, a small door that opened only when she placed her hand against it, and the light scanned her skin and whispered a word in her old tongue, welcome, and the door opened with a soft sound like wind over water inside. were eyes wide and wet and full of disbelief, voices crying and arms reaching, and names spoken like prayers. She was home and they were still alive, hiding, waiting, surviving, and she wanted to cry and scream and laugh all at once. But her eyes turned toward the entrance where he stood outside watching, unsure if he was welcomed. They called him enemy. They called him danger. They raised weapons and shields and old fear. But Leary stepped forward, her arms wide, her voice strong, her words clear. No, she said, no, he is not the enemy. He is why I am alive. He is why I came back. He is why we are here. The air inside the shelter was thick with voices, names, cries, and the sound of running feet, and Leary stood in the middle of it all, her heart beating fast, her hands gripping the edge of her sleeve, as faces old and young surrounded her, eyes full of tears and wonder as they touched her arms, her hair, her cheeks, whispering words she had not heard in so long, words of home, words of hope. She had thought they were all gone, lost to fire and silence and time, but they were here, hidden deep under the ruins, living in the dark, breathing in fear, but alive, and when they saw her, they reached out, as if touching her would make their pain go away, and for a while it did. But outside, the human waited alone near the ship, his head lowered, his body still like a shadow at the edge of light. He had not followed her inside, he had not raised his voice or hands. He had only watched and waited, and now that she was safe, now that she had her people again, he did not move inside the shelter. The elders sat in a circle and listened as she told them everything, her voice steady, as she spoke of the cage, the ship, the cold moon, the escape, the creature in the snow, the warm food, the soft bed, the learning, the laughter, the drone, the fire, the stars, and him. When she finished, they were silent. Some stared at the floor, others looked at her with eyes full of fear or doubt, and one elder stood with slow hands and sharp breath, and said the words she had feared since the moment she saw the shelter, since the moment she knew they were still alive. He cannot stay, he must leave. He is human, he is danger, he is the reason we hid. Leary stood still, her fingers shaking, her voice stuck behind her teeth. She looked around at the faces of her people and saw love, yes, but also walls, walls built from pain, from war, from loss, and she understood them, but her heart ached, because she knew something they did not, something they would not believe, until it was too late. She walked back to the door, the one that led out to the ashen sky, and as it opened, she saw him still waiting near the ship, quiet, as always, calm as stone, and when he saw her, he smiled, not wide, not big, just that same small smile, that had never once asked her to stay, or to leave, or to choose. She walked to him, slowly, her hands clenched, her breath thin, and when she reached him, she stopped and looked up into his eyes, and said one word, not loud, not soft, just true. Stay. He looked at her, then at the sky, then at the shelter in the hill, and shook his head slow and gentle, and pointed back to the stars, back to the ship, back to the road that did not end, and said the word home. Her chest tightened, and her legs felt weak, and she wanted to scream, to beg, to grab his hand and pull him into the shelter, into the warmth, into her world, but she did not. She only stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest and whispered, please. Behind her, the elders had followed, the guards had weapons, but did not raise them. The people stood watching, unsure, afraid, curious, and the elder spoke again, this is not his place, he does not belong. But Leary turned her head and spoke loud and clear, her voice sharp, like wind through trees, her back straight, and her heart strong. He belongs because I belong. And I would not be here without him. I would not be alive. I would not be whole, and I will not stay without him. The words hung in the air like fires, slow and hot and burning away the silence, and no one moved for a long breath. 4243, and then a child stepped forward and walked to the human and placed a flower in his hand, a flower made of light and wire and thread, and said, thank you. And that small act broke something, broke the fear, broke the wall, and slowly others came forward. One by one, not with flowers, but with eyes that saw him not as a monster, but as a man, not as a threat, but as the reason. Their sister had returned. The human did not speak much, he never had, but he looked at them and nodded, and that was enough. And when Leary reached up and took his hand, he did not pull away. That night they sat beside the fire under the open sky, the stars blinking above, the smoke drifting high, and the people sat around them, listening to stories of flight and fire and frost and faith. And Leary told them everything, and he listened, his hand still in hers, his eyes soft, his heart open. Later, when the stars were fading and the night was turning into morning, Leary looked at him and said one last word, mine, and he looked at her and answered, yours. And the world began again. Not with war, not with pain, but with quiet light and joined hands, and the promise that even after fire, even after cages, even after silence, something beautiful could still be born.